People, they are doing construction outside of my house. I apologize if the mic picks it up, but it's actually kind of on theme because today, your best friend Patrick Fair and Fistful of Card proudly present our new deck building guide. It is for the one, the only Landslide, everybody's favorite list to play and play against. Also known as Dudes and Deeds, also called Slide by his friends. Landslide is a fundamental deck, but before we get into the nitty gritty of all that, we're going to talk about who is this for and what is our goal. If you're the kind of player who likes to play super basic fundamental decks, or who likes to push the win condition as hard and as fast as possible, this one's for you. Our goal is to put as many control points and as many production pieces, aka as many deeds, into play as possible, in order to overwhelm our opponent before they are able to stabilize and before they are able to counter us. So, the first things first, you look at this list and you say, there is no structure, and that's right. We have very little structure, and that's because we are a passive list, meaning we don't get into shootouts. We can make flushes out of spades and diamonds, and occasionally we can make a straight or a straight flush out of diamonds. But in reality, none of that really matters because you won't be fighting very often, if at all, because it's not good to be reliant on flushes, typically, when everyone else is building full house decks. So instead of going through sort of our structure and how we pick the cards we pick and combos and things like that you can use in Shootout to maximize your efficientness, what we're going to talk about today is how you build this deck, because that is where the efficient cards come into play. So we're going to start off with diamonds, and you guessed it, we're playing a lot of 2/1/1s. You'll hear me talk about this kind of card over and over and over again. 2/1/1s make up the backbone of a lot of super powerful deeds, and this is no exception. However, there is also sort of a subtle play style power to 2/1/1s in this particular deck that's also true in other decks, but is more relevant in this deck. And what I mean by that is that let's go look at Blake Ranch for a second. Now, Blake Ranch is a very popular card. It's run in a lot of decks. It is a out-of-town deed. It is a 4-cost deed that has 3 production, but no control points. So let's talk about why this kind of card is typically a trap for our Dudes and Deeds decks. Now, what happens typically is that your opponent should be able to stop you from playing deeds, or at least stop your production, or they should try. That's how you beat these kinds of decks, is you stomp on their production at every opportunity. And so you should assume when picking deeds to put into your list and picking dudes to put into your list that we want to have low risk. You should assume that your opponent just will take everything that you put into play. And so anything that you put into your deck that you're like, well, if my opponent takes that, it's going to be a big problem, then you just don't bother. Just leave it in the binder. And so Blake Ranch is an example of that kind of card, because worst case scenario, we put it into play and our opponent just sits on it. Well, that's one, they've spent 1 influence, they've spent 1 dude to block 3 of our production. There's no control point to be gained, and we've spent 4 money basically to counter 1 influence, or to occupy 1 of their influence. And that's just mathematically not very good. However, if we have the same amount of money, if I spend 4 Ghost Rock on 2 2/1/1 deeds, then what I've done is I've lowered my possible production by 1, because I can't get 3 production, I'm only getting 2, but I have 2 control points, and my opponent has to spend twice as many resources in order to counter my play entirely. And if they can't counter my play entirely, then the snowball keeps rolling. And that's, at the end of the day, what we want, is we want a little bit at a time. As long as we're always moving and shaking, we're doing good. And so 2/1/1s, 1/0s, things of that nature is what this deck is full of. We do have some 3/2s, but in addition to expensive deeds, high production, or expensive cost, high production deeds, what we don't want to see is deeds that give our opponent some sort of benefit. Now, things like, for example, Yanli's Tailoring, or the Bunkhouse, or the Mayor's Office, are all these that kind of effectively do the same thing, which is they all have abilities that increase influence. Now, you might say, well, I can also use that too, but remember, you can't defend your deeds in a deck that can't fight, because our structure is too weak. And because of that, deeds like this create problems, because not only do your opponent sitting on it means that you lose the production, you lose the control point, but in addition, they also use the ability to give another one of their dudes an influence, which essentially blocks another control point. It also lets them do plays that they possibly couldn't have done before. Things like giving Willa May an influence, or any influenceless dude that they have in play, give them an influence, allow them to take another deed, at least for the turn. And that's something we don't want to see. So anything like this, just ignore it. Dudes are in a very similar light. All we're basically looking for is cheap influence. Their abilities, sometimes they matter depending on what faction you're playing and what you're doing and things like that, but by and large, it's just the math that really makes them powerful. Any dude in this deck, any dude that costs 4 or less, that has 0 upkeep, and has at least 1 influence, is considered to be put into the deck. You'll see that we have things like Johnny Brocklehurst, we have Hamshanks, Theo, Hiram, things of that nature, Virginia, and none of these dudes are particularly powerful in this deck. Their abilities don't matter. What does matter is that they're mathematically strong. Remember, this is a fundamentalist deck. We care less about what the pieces do, but just that we have the pieces that we need. So, in addition to that costing equation, we also have any dude that costs 5 or less, that has 1 upkeep but 2 influence. So that gives us things like Olivia Jenks and Steel Archer. What you'll find is the effectiveness of your faction at playing this kind of deck, or the effectiveness that you'll find playing this kind of deck, will depend on what faction you're going to play. And so, as a brief, vague overview, outlaws, anarchists, and entrepreneurs currently have the best potential to make this kind of deck, with fearmongers being by far the worst, and first people also being pretty bad at just playing this sort of passive dudes and deeds. Now, this isn't the only way to play this deck. There's tons and tons. There's so much flexibility with this because, like I said, it's just fundamentals. So you'll see a lot of people going, well, that's shooty slide, and that's spell slide, and that's gadget slide, and that's horse slide, and it's because, in reality, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but in reality, people are just kind of taking chunks that we can learn from this deck and applying them to other aspects. So to finish us out, we also have 3 moving forward and 4 rumors. Now, moving forward is a kind of cheeky card that can be played in these kinds of decks. Its ability is it's a cheating resolution. You can play it in shootouts, obviously, but we will most commonly be playing it in lowball because we don't want to get into shootouts. And what it allows us to do is search our deck and grab deeds. Now, there's 2 schools of thought, and I'm going to explain them both. School of thought number 1 is that you go and you grab any deed that's on, in your deck, and you go grab just effective, powerful deeds, and you use it to accelerate. And that's how we're doing it, is that we don't have any cheeky deeds or any crazy crap like that you can use, but we just have I've drawn my 5th card for my hand, and now I go grab another deed, and maybe I have a bunch of deeds in hand, and I can just accelerate my game plan. And that's largely because this card is pretty unreliable, because it relies on our opponent to cheat, which is, common, but not every turn, not every game. So, the other side of this coin is that people will put things like First Baptist Church or the Whately Estate into their deck, and those deeds have multiple control points, and they also don't have production, so they're free, because we do have to pay the production of the deed as its cost. So we don't do that, but feel free to experiment with that, and the reason that you would do that is because it's very explosive. All of the things I said about accelerating your game plan and things like that are doubly true if I can go grab the Whately Estate and have a 2 control point deed that boots people who try to block it. I mean, that's a very, very powerful play. However, if you fill your deck with tons of those cards and you aren't getting them out with moving forward, then they're very, very weak. They actually become a huge detriment, because then they become even worse versions of Blake Ranch, where you're spending a huge amount of your own cash in order to put a very limited deed into play. And so that's something to consider with this card. Rumors, we have a 4 of. Rumors is often misused, and there's kind of a divide in the community on whether or not it's a good card or a bad card. I'm going to explain that Rumors is a good card. The problem is a lot of people use it to put people in check as opposed to keep people in check. And the difference is this. If I am currently checking you, or if I'm if I'm not currently checking you, I have 4 control points, you have 4 influence, and I play a rumors. The rider on rumors is that you can send a dude home and get that influence back. Because as long as they're at home, they get their influence back. And so I've put you into check, but there's a very easy way for you to get out of check, right? So that's where this card is not good. Where this card is good is by keeping people in check. If I have checked you with my deeds alone, and you have to spend that very finite amount of resources that you have left to try and get yourself out of check, then rumors comes into play, and it's like, well, I was checking you, you got out of check by putting all of your dudes onto as many of my deeds as possible. Well, I'm going to play 2 rumors, now you're down influence, and you can't just retreat home because I was already checking you, so it keeps people in check. And that's what this card is good at, not putting people into check, keeping people into check. And that's essentially the entire list. And there isn't really a whole lot else to talk about in terms of building this list. This is just a passive slide list. You'll see a lot of different variations of this thing. So for the rest of this video, I kind of want to talk about a couple of different aspects. One thing about this deck that's commonly misunderstood is that this list is not a control deck. It's not a combo deck. A lot of people think that because it is thematically passive, it is one of those 2 archetypes. Because in other games like Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon and stuff like that, decks that tend to avoid the combat aspect of the game are passive decks. They're reactionary decks, and people sort of associate this deck with that. So they're like, oh, it's a control deck, or it's a combo deck. It's doing something that's kind of like anti-fun. It's not a fundamentalist deck. It's not doing shootouts. However, this is an aggro deck. This is the most aggro deck in the game. Because the win condition of Doomtown has never been have the most bullets or get into the most shootouts. Those are just means to an end. At the end of the day, the win condition of Doomtown has always been have more control points than your opponent has influence. And because of that, what we'll see here is that we'll see that this deck only can push the win condition. We can't protect the win condition. We can't fight over the win condition. We've foregone huge chunks of gameplay in order to just streamline into, well, what is the win condition of the game? Have more control points than my opponent has influence? Well, what if my entire deck was just control points? Right? And so you'll see a lot of players, I go on the forums and the Discord and the Facebook and stuff, and I'll see time and time and again, people will, especially new players, will come in and go, what, I just played against Landslide for the first time, and my community's really angry, and we don't play that here, and the designers need to, ban deeds above X many control points in your deck or in play, and you shouldn't be able to play more than X many control points in a turn and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, this is just the core fundamentals of the game. It just promotes movement and money and control points and things of that nature. And so I think this deck in particular, I don't actually think is very good. And by that I mean I don't think you're going to win Gen Con with a passive slide list more often than not. However, what we can gain from this is we can use this as a learning tool. And so I want to leave you with this kind of concept. Over the course of this deck building series, we've talked about a lot of different kinds of things, and we're going to continue the series and you do more and more stuff. However, something for you to think about in your own deck building is that Doomtown is at its core based on 3 specific things. It's based on control points, influence, and ghost rock. And so every deck that you build, I don't care what list you're making, I don't care if you're playing slide, I don't care if you're playing the hardest of the hardcore shootout decks, you need to answer the questions of, how do I make ghost rock? How do I make control points? And how do I make influence? Because that's going to determine, how do I win? How do I win the game? And then the reverse of that also is how I win the game. It's, how do I take away influence? How do I take away control points? And how do I take away my opponent's ghost rock? Now, the answer to those questions might be, I can't. For example, in this list, I have rumors, but outside of rumors, I don't have any way of really reliably taking away my opponent's influence. And so that's something that I have to accept. If I run into a deck that is just hats on hats on hats, and it's just like, oh yeah, I'm playing hats out of Beyond the Veil with hats and all the weird dudes that get bonuses and give bonuses with hats, and I've got 48 influence, you might just lose. You might just lose the game because you can't interact with your opponent in the combat aspect of the game. But in other decks, that also might be a problem. You might say, well, my deck has really low starting influence, but I'm able to do this really cool thing with my starting influence because I've chosen this starting posse. But I might just lose to Outlaw Control Point Rush or Dudes and Deeds or any of these generate a bunch of control points really, really quickly decks. And you have to be able to answer, is that okay? Can I just accept that that's the case? Or do I need to make some changes? Do I need to start more influence, even if it means that my goal is a little bit slower, a little bit weaker than it was with this starting posse? Or do I just accept that? Do I just go hardline into the goal and accept the fact that I'm going to lose to control point rush decks or whatever the heck your deck is bad against? And so, remember, you just need to focus on those three things. Because at the end of the day, Doomtown is about those three things. Those all push the win condition, deny the win condition, and any deck you build is going to need those things. This has been your best friend, Patrick Fair. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And we'll see you next time.